After a broken bond, the Omega rebuilt a cabin. The Alpha King knocked at dusk. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Elena Brooks. The bond broke without a sound. No thunder, no public accusation, just a quiet certainty settling into Elena Brooks' chest as she stood at the edge of the pack hall and realized the future she had imagined would never arrive. The connection she once felt like a steady heartbeat had gone still, leaving behind an ache that wasn't sharp but heavy. The kind that followed her as she turned away and walked out under a gray sky with her shoulders straight and her hands empty, choosing not to look back. Because some endings demanded dignity more than answers. And by nightfall she was already beyond the last boundary marker. Boots crunching on frost, breath steady, mind clear in a way she hadn't felt in years. Because the moment the bond ended, the noise of expectations ended with it, and the quiet felt honest. Elena traveled until the road thinned and the trees thickened, until the air smelled like pine and clean earth and the world stopped asking her who she belonged to. And there she found a clearing with enough light and enough shelter to try, really try, at a life that would be hers alone. So she measured space with her steps, counted boards salvaged from an old shed down the ridge, hauled water by the gallon from a stream that ran cold even in late fall, and built with patience instead of hope. A cabin that wasn't impressive but was solid, 10 by 12 feet, a roof that held, a door that closed, a place where the wind couldn't decide her worth. Days passed marked by practical victories, a fire that caught on the first strike, a window set straight, a table that didn't wobble, and nights arrived quietly with stars sharp as pins and a silence that didn't judge. And in that stillness Elena learned the difference between loneliness and peace, learned how to split logs efficiently, how to track time by the sun's angle, how to trust her hands again, because healing didn't announce itself. It accumulated, small and stubborn, like warmth returning to fingers after winter cold. By the time the first snow dusted the ground, the cabin smelled of cedar and smoke, her boots dried by the door, a kettle ready on the stove, and Elena could finally sit, breathe, and accept that the bond breaking hadn't ended her, it had redirected her, and that truth settled into her bones as dusk painted the trees bronze and purple, a calm hour when the day released its grip, and then, as she tightened a hinge and checked the latch, a sound cut through the quiet, deliberate and respectful. 3 knocks at the door, measured, waiting, the kind of knock that asked permission rather than claimed it, and Elena froze, heart steady but alert, because she knew the rhythm even before she reached for the handle, knew who would stand on the other side when the light faded and the world held its breath. Elena did not open the door right away, not because she was afraid, but because she needed to feel her feet on the floor and remember where she was. Remember that this place existed because she had built it with her own hands, measured each plank in inches, set each nail straight, carried water in 5-gallon buckets until her arms ached, and learned that strength could be quiet and still be real. So she rested her palm against the wood and let the moment stretch, listening to the wind brush the eaves and the low crackle of the fire behind her, while outside the light slipped lower and shadows lengthened. And when she finally pulled the door open, the air changed, not dramatically, just enough to confirm what her instincts already knew, because Rowan Hale stood there without armor or entourage, no crown, no banner, only a dark coat dusted with frost and a posture that was careful, as if he understood that one wrong movement could end the conversation before it began, and he did not step forward, did not fill the doorway. He waited on the threshold like a guest, like a man who knew he was not owed entry. Elena met his eyes and felt the old familiarity flicker and fade, not pain exactly, more like a memory losing its sharp edges, and she noted the details she had once ignored, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way he kept his hands visible, the way his breath slowed when he realized she was not turning him away, and in that suspended space neither of them spoke, because words would rush things, and this was not a moment that wanted speed. It wanted honesty measured in seconds rather than promises. Rowan broke the silence first, his voice even and low, saying her name without the title he once used, as if he were testing whether he still had the right to say it at all, and Elena nodded once. Not an invitation, just an acknowledgement, and asked what he wanted, not why he was there, because the why was obvious. The bond had not vanished cleanly. It had loosened and left questions behind, and Rowan answered simply that he wanted to see her, to know she was alive and well, to say that he was sorry without asking anything in return, and the simplicity of it surprised her more than any declaration could have. She stepped back half a pace, opening the space just enough for the cold to drift in, and told him he could stand by the fire for a minute, not inside, just close enough to warm his hands, because kindness did not have to equal surrender, and Rowan accepted the terms without comment, moving only when she did, eyes taking in the cabin without judgment, noticing the straight beams, the sturdy table, the kettle steaming softly, understanding without being told that this place was not temporary. It was a decision. They spoke of practical things, the road conditions, the early snow, how many miles he had traveled since dawn, details that felt safe, grounding, and when silence returned it was comfortable, not strained, and Elena realized that the ache she had carried was lighter than it used to be, not because he was there, but because she was no longer bracing for disappointment. When Rowan finally said he would leave before dark, she believed him, and that trust surprised her too, and as he turned to go he paused, not to plead, but to say that if she ever wanted help, not as an Omega, not as something broken or claimed, but as Elena Brooks, he would listen, and then he stepped back into the fading light, leaving the choice where it belonged, in her hands, and Elena closed the door gently, leaning her forehead against the wood for a moment, not in grief, but in acknowledgement of something shifting, something slow and careful, like the first warmth after a long winter. The morning after Rowan left, Elena woke before sunrise and stepped outside with a mug of coffee warming her hands, the steam rising into air that smelled like snow and pine, and she realized that the quiet felt different now, not disturbed, just expanded, as if the world had acknowledged her presence and then respectfully stepped back. So she went about her routine with steady focus, checking the roofline, reinforcing a loose board near the window, stacking firewood measured and neat, because routine was how she kept her footing, and by mid-morning she was hauling another load from the edge of the clearing, counting steps the way she always did, 30 yards from the tree line, 60 back, muscle memory anchoring her thoughts when her mind tried to wander. She told herself that Rowan's visit was an event, not a turning point, that the knock had ended when the door closed, and that belief held until she found the small repair she had meant to do for weeks, the hinge that caught when the temperature dropped. So she took out her tools and worked carefully, noticing how the wood grain curved and how the screws seated cleanly, and she smiled despite herself because this cabin answered to her alone. It did not care about titles or bonds or expectations. It only responded to effort. As the day warmed to the low 40s, she cleared a patch behind the cabin and laid stones for a path, each one chosen for weight and shape, because permanence mattered, and as she worked she remembered how often she had waited before, waited for approval, waited for permission, waited for someone else to decide when her life would begin, and that memory felt distant now, like an old habit she no longer practiced. When the sun dipped and shadows lengthened again, she cooked a simple meal and ate by the window, watching a hawk circle once before disappearing beyond the ridge, and the sight felt like a quiet affirmation that movement did not require announcement. Days followed with the same rhythm, and on the third afternoon she heard footsteps approach, not hurried, not heavy, and she did not tense this time. She simply turned and saw Rowan standing at the edge of the clearing, far enough back to show respect, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and she waited, because patience had become one of her strengths. He raised his hand in greeting and said he had brought supplies he thought might help: nails, a replacement hinge, a weatherproof sealant rated for below zero, things chosen with care rather than display, and Elena considered him for a long moment before nodding, not smiling, but not closing the distance either, and she gestured to a flat stone where he could set them down. They talked while she inspected the items, discussing measurements in inches, the best way to angle a roof brace against heavy snow, the practicality of adding a second window for light, and in those practical exchanges something eased, because knowledge met knowledge without hierarchy. Rowan did not stay long, and when he left he did not look back, trusting that if she wanted him to return she would say so, and that trust mattered more than his presence. That night Elena reinforced the hinge with the new hardware and tested the door, opening and closing it until it moved smoothly. And as she set the tools away she understood something clearly. That rebuilding was not about erasing the past or inviting it back in. It was about choosing what fit now. And for the first time since the bond broke, the choice felt fully hers. Winter settled in fully by the end of the week. Not harsh, just steady, the kind that required planning and rewarded consistency. And Elena adjusted without drama, rising earlier, banking the fire higher, tracking daylight by the angle it slid across the cabin floor, because she had learned that survival was not a single decision but a series of small, correct ones made repeatedly. She reinforced the window frame with weather stripping, measured twice before setting nails, and tested the door each night with a firm pull, satisfied by the quiet resistance that told her the hinge held true. The path of stones behind the cabin grew longer, each piece set flush, and she noticed how the work changed her posture, how her shoulders relaxed as her hands stayed busy, how her thoughts aligned with the rhythm of effort rather than expectation. On the fourth morning after Rowan's return with supplies, she found herself humming while she cooked, a low, unplanned sound that surprised her into a small laugh, because it had been a long time since joy had slipped in without permission. She thought of Rowan then, not as a presence, but as a variable, something that existed without demanding her attention, and that felt healthy. She spent the afternoon splitting logs into uniform lengths, stacking them by the shed she had added with leftover boards, counting cords, and estimating how many weeks they would last at current burn rates, using the numbers to ground herself, because numbers did not argue with feelings, they clarified them. Near dusk she heard the familiar approach again, not a knock this time, just a call of her name carried on the air, respectful and distant, and she stepped onto the porch with her jacket zipped, hands free, heart calm. Rowan stood by the edge of the clearing with a thermos in one hand and a rolled map in the other, and he asked if she would like to see a weather pattern he had noticed, something that might bring heavier snow by next weekend, and she considered the offer on its merits, not its history, then nodded once. They stood side by side but not touching, tracing routes with a finger, discussing windbreaks and the way drifts formed against the ridge, and Elena appreciated the competence of the exchange, the absence of pressure, because this was what partnership looked like when it was earned rather than assumed. When the cold deepened, Rowan poured coffee into 2 cups and held his at chest level, speaking about the pack only in general terms, mentioning repairs to the South Road, a shared effort to reinforce a bridge, keeping his tone neutral, not asking her to return or implying she should care, and she respected him for that restraint. Elena spoke about the cabin, about how she planned to add a second layer of insulation before the real freeze, and Rowan listened with the kind of attention that did not interrupt, and she realized that listening had become his apology, consistent and unforced. As the light faded, he said he would head back while the trail was still clear, and she thanked him for the map, not for the visit, and that distinction mattered. After he left, Elena returned inside and set the cups to dry, then sat at the table and wrote a short list of tasks for the week, simple and achievable, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in the ink settling on paper because it represented intention without obligation. That night the wind rose and pressed against the cabin, testing seams and resolve, and Elena slept through it, secure in the knowledge that the structure held, that she had built something capable of weathering pressure, and as dawn came pale and steady, she understood that healing was not loud, it was durable, and it showed itself in the way she met the day without bracing for loss. Rowan Hale returned to the capital before nightfall, the distance measured not just in miles but in restraint, because leaving Elena's clearing always required him to slow his instincts and choose patience over certainty, and as the gates closed behind him the familiar weight of responsibility settled back onto his shoulders, steady and unyielding, yet changed by the knowledge that leadership without humility had once cost him something irreplaceable. He moved through the halls quietly, nodding to those who greeted him, keeping conversations focused on logistics, winter stores, road maintenance, the allocation of supplies measured in tons and weeks, because clarity mattered, and he had learned the hard way that silence could be kinder than authority. At night, he reviewed maps by lamplight, the same kind he had shared with Elena, tracing routes with a pencil and noting pressure points where storms would slow travel, and he found himself thinking less about command and more about care, a shift subtle enough that no one else would notice, but deep enough to alter his decisions. Sleep came unevenly, not from guilt, but from the effort of holding space for something unresolved without trying to force an outcome. And when he woke before dawn, he did not reach for power. He reached for discipline, starting his day with measured steps and deliberate breathing, reminding himself that presence was not possession. In council meetings, he listened longer than he spoke, allowing others to finish, weighing their words without rushing to conclusion. And when a younger alpha challenged a supply route recommendation, Rowan accepted the correction with a nod and adjusted the plan, because strength that refused adaptation had already proven brittle. Between obligations, he found quiet moments to reflect on the cabin, not as a destination but as a symbol of what Elena had built when no one was watching, and the thought grounded him, reinforcing his resolve to approach her life with respect rather than expectation. He sent instructions for additional materials to be staged along the North Trail, not as a gift with strings, but as preparedness for anyone who might need them, ensuring that the support he offered would never single her out or pressure her to respond. When asked privately why he traveled the ridge more often now, he answered honestly that the weather demanded attention, and left it at that, because truth did not require full disclosure. On the fifth evening, he stood on a balcony overlooking the training grounds as snow began to fall in a light, persistent pattern, flakes catching in his hair and melting slowly. And he understood that rebuilding trust was less about grand gestures and more about consistency under ordinary conditions. He recalled the way Elena had inspected the supplies he brought, the way she evaluated utility rather than intent, and he welcomed that standard, because it kept him accountable to actions rather than words. Before retiring, he wrote a brief note to himself, not a letter to send, but a reminder to maintain boundaries, to let time do its work, to remember that leadership extended beyond territory into behavior, and that apology was a process rather than a moment. As the city settled and the snowfall thickened, Rowan felt a calm determination take hold, the kind that did not demand immediate resolution, only steady effort, and he accepted that whatever future existed would be built like that cabin, board by board, hinge by hinge, tested by weather and patience alike, and that for the first time he was willing to meet that future without rushing ahead of the work. The storm Rowan had marked on the map arrived 2 days earlier than expected, not violent, just relentless, a steady curtain of snow that softened edges and demanded attention, and by mid-morning he made the decision to travel the ridge himself, not as a visit but as a check, because preparation meant verifying assumptions in real conditions. So he packed light, chose the northern trail for its wind cover, and set out. With measured steps, counting miles by landmarks he knew well, the old pines split by lightning, the shallow creek now hidden under ice, the bend where the path narrowed to a single track, each reference confirming progress without haste. As he moved, he kept his pace conservative, conserving energy and visibility, because leadership had taught him that arriving intact mattered more than arriving early, and the snow tested that discipline, accumulating on his coat and muffling sound, creating a quiet that sharpened focus rather than fear. He thought of Elena not as an objective, but as a variable within the environment, someone competent and cautious, someone who would already be accounting for drift patterns and roof load, and the thought steadied him, reducing urgency to intention. By the time the clearing came into view, the sky had dimmed to a uniform gray, and smoke rose in a clean line from the cabin chimney, a simple signal that meant heat and planning. And Rowan stopped at the tree line, taking in the scene without advancing, noting the reinforced window, the stacked wood, the path stones now nearly buried but still visible in places, evidence of work done with foresight. He waited until Elena stepped onto the porch on her own, her jacket zipped, her stance balanced, and only then did he move forward enough to be seen, lifting a hand to signal presence without surprise, and she acknowledged him with a nod that carried no question. They spoke briefly, voices calm, exchanging information rather than emotion, the snow depth measured in inches, the wind shift expected by evening, the benefit of clearing the path again before nightfall, and Elena mentioned the extra insulation she had added, how the interior temperature held steady even as the air dropped, and Rowan listened, adjusting his assessment accordingly. He offered to help clear the path to the shed, not to prove anything, just to reduce risk, and Elena considered for a moment before agreeing, handing him a shovel without ceremony, and they worked side by side with efficient movements, coordinating without discussion, the sound of metal against packed snow punctuating the quiet. Time passed unnoticed as the work took shape, the path widening, the edge defined, and when they finished, both breathing evenly, Elena poured hot coffee into sturdy mugs, and they stood near the door, steam rising between them, the proximity practical rather than charged. Rowan mentioned that he would stay within range until the storm passed, camping along the ridge to monitor conditions, not inside, not nearby, just close enough to respond if needed, and Elena accepted the plan with a simple thank you that acknowledged intent without obligation. As dusk approached, the snowfall thickened and visibility dropped, and Rowan adjusted his route accordingly, marking his exit points and committing them to memory, while Elena secured the door, tested the latch, and checked the fire, both of them performing familiar rituals shaped by responsibility. When Rowan turned to leave, Elena said his name once, stopping him long enough to say that she appreciated the clarity, the way he stated what he would do without expectation, and Rowan nodded, receiving the words as guidance rather than reward, then stepped back into the snow, disappearing gradually as the landscape absorbed him. Inside the cabin, Elena settled into the quiet with the assurance that preparedness had been shared without intrusion, and as the storm pressed against the walls, she felt no urge to brace, only the steady confidence that came from choices aligned with reality, knowing that whatever the night brought, she had built something that could hold. By late afternoon, the storm eased into a fine, persistent fall, the kind that quieted the world without erasing it, and Elena noticed the change by the way the light returned, thin and pale, slipping between clouds and reflecting off the snow like brushed steel. So she finished clearing the porch, checked the latch one more time, and set a kettle on the stove, not from anticipation but from habit, because preparation had become her language. The cabin held warmth steadily, the insulation doing its work, and as dusk approached she stood by the window and watched the ridge line, seeing nothing but drifting flakes until a shape resolved into movement, slow and deliberate. And she recognized Rowan's pace before she recognized his outline, not because of memory, but because he moved as someone careful not to intrude. She waited, letting him reach the edge of the clearing, letting him be the one to signal, and when he did, lifting his hand once and stopping well short of the door, she felt the moment settle rather than spike, a calm she trusted. She opened the door before he knocked, not as an invitation but as acknowledgement, and the air shifted, cold meeting warm, dusk pressing gently at the threshold. Rowan stood with snow dusting his shoulders, eyes steady, posture open, and he spoke first, saying he was checking conditions before nightfall, that the trail would be passable for another hour at most, and Elena nodded, stepping aside just enough to allow him to stand inside the door frame without crossing fully into the cabin, a boundary respected by both. They talked about the weather window, about how quickly the temperature would drop, about the importance of keeping the path visible, and Elena pointed out the markers she had set earlier, thin poles spaced at measured intervals, and Rowan acknowledged the foresight with a simple nod, adjusting his plan accordingly. Silence followed, not awkward, just present, and in it Elena noticed the subtle changes in him, the way he waited for her cues, the way his gaze followed her movements without claiming them, and she understood that restraint was his work now, practiced daily, not just when she was watching. Rowan said he would remain within reach through the night, not nearby, but close enough to respond if the wind shifted or visibility dropped unexpectedly, and he made it clear that he would not return unless called, that the decision would always be hers, and Elena believed him, not because of words but because of the pattern he had established. She poured hot water into a thermos he had brought back to refill, hands steady, movements efficient, and passed it to him without ceremony, and the exchange felt balanced, like neighbors sharing tools rather than a history negotiating terms. As the sky deepened to blue-gray and the first stars struggled into view, Rowan stepped back, pausing only long enough to say that he respected what she had built, that he saw the care in it, and that he would not ask her to dismantle it for anyone, including him, and the statement landed with weight precisely because it asked nothing in return. Elena watched him turn away, his figure gradually absorbed by the dimming landscape, and she closed the door gently, securing the latch, then leaned against it for a moment, not from weakness but from recognition, because something had shifted again, not toward certainty, but toward clarity. She returned to the stove, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat at the table as night settled, listening to the soft sounds of the cabin holding, the wind testing edges and finding them firm, and she understood that trust was not rebuilt by proximity alone. It was rebuilt by honoring distance, by choosing presence when invited and absence when required. And as the fire burned low and steady, Elena felt ready for whatever came next, not because it was promised, but because she had learned how to meet it on her own terms. The next morning arrived clear and brittle, the storm having passed cleanly, leaving the world reset and precise, and Elena moved through the cabin with practiced ease, opening the shutters to let light spill across the floor, checking the thermometer nailed near the door, noting the temperature in the low 20s and adjusting the fire accordingly, because attention to detail had become her calm. She stepped outside to assess the path, boots crunching softly, and found the markers standing true, the stones visible where she had cleared them, evidence that preparation had done its work. From the ridge came a faint signal, not a call, just movement resolving into form, and Rowan appeared again at a respectful distance, stopping where the tree line thinned, waiting as he always did now. And Elena felt the choice settle into her chest, steady and clear. She waved him closer, not to the door, but to the table she had set on the porch, a simple surface between them, and when he approached he did so without haste, eyes attentive, posture open, carrying nothing but the quiet he seemed to cultivate intentionally. They spoke first of ordinary things, the way the snow crusted overnight, the advantage of clearing early, the route he would take back before noon. And then Elena shifted the conversation with a single sentence delivered without heat or softness, asking him why he had come all this way when the bond was already broken. Rowan did not answer immediately, and she appreciated the pause, the care taken not to fill silence with defense. And when he spoke his voice was even, saying he came because he had learned that endings did not absolve responsibility, that he had mistaken authority for certainty, and that losing the bond had not erased his obligation to act with integrity toward her. Elena listened without interruption, hands wrapped around her mug, noticing how her breathing stayed slow, how the old reflex to brace did not appear, and she told him plainly that the bond breaking had been necessary, that it had forced her to build a life that did not depend on being chosen, and that whatever existed now would have to respect that foundation. Rowan accepted this without argument, nodding once, acknowledging the line drawn, and said he was not there to repair the past or claim the future, only to state clearly that he would not cross her boundaries again, that any step forward would require her invitation, not his persistence. The honesty did not feel performative, it felt restrained, and that restraint mattered. Elena considered him in the clean light, seeing not the Alpha King as others did, but a man learning to carry power without imposing it, and she responded with equal clarity, telling him that trust for her was cumulative, built by consistency rather than declarations, and that she would continue as she was, measuring actions over time. Rowan agreed, stating that he would remain available in practical ways, maintaining the roads, staging supplies for winter travel, ensuring safety without proximity, and Elena appreciated the specificity, because vague promises had once failed her. When the conversation ended it did so naturally, no crescendo, no tension seeking release, and Rowan rose from the bench, preparing to leave, pausing only to ask if there was anything she needed before he went. Elena shook her head, not dismissively, but with assurance, and thanked him for respecting her pace. As he walked away, she felt no pull to follow, no ache to hold him back, only a grounded sense of alignment, and when she returned inside and closed the door, the sound was solid and final in the best way, marking not separation but stability. She sat at the table and wrote her plans for the week, tasks measured and achievable, and as the sun climbed higher she understood that confrontation did not always arrive as conflict. Sometimes it arrived as clarity spoken calmly, and she felt ready for whatever form the next choice would take. Spring announced itself quietly, not with warmth at first, but with light, longer mornings, and the subtle give of thawing ground beneath Elena's boots. And she noticed the change the way she noticed most things now, through function before feeling, adjusting routines, opening the cabin earlier, airing blankets, testing soil where she planned to plant. Because continuity mattered more than milestones. The cabin stood firm, weathered but reliable, and the path behind it showed through the melt, stones emerging like punctuation marks, reminders of effort that endured. Days passed with purposeful calm, and Elena found satisfaction in small expansions, a second window framed and sealed, a bench added to the porch, a ledger kept neat with dates and notes, because structure supported freedom rather than limiting it. Rowan did not return unannounced, and that absence was not a void. It was a confirmation, proof that restraint could be maintained over time. And when she heard from him, it was through practical channels, a message relayed with supplies, an update posted at the trailhead about repairs completed, the kind of communication that respected distance while remaining present. On a late afternoon when the air hovered near 50 and the sky held steady blue, Elena saw him again at the edge of the clearing, not by coincidence, but by arrangement. The meeting agreed upon earlier through simple, direct words, and she felt no rush, only readiness. He approached with the same care he had learned to practice, stopping short, waiting for her signal, and she gestured to the porch, not inviting him inside but acknowledging shared ground, and they stood together facing the open landscape rather than each other, a subtle choice that mattered. Rowan spoke first, saying he had stepped back from certain duties, delegating more, reshaping his role so that leadership would no longer eclipse listening, and he did not frame it as sacrifice, only as alignment, and Elena appreciated the precision. She responded by sharing her plans, expanding the cabin footprint by a few feet, installing rain collection, staying through the next winter by choice rather than necessity, and Rowan listened, nodding, asking questions that clarified rather than redirected. Silence followed, comfortable and unforced, and in it Elena felt something settle, not a pull toward the past, but a grounded openness toward what might be built slowly, with consent and care. Rowan turned to her then, not stepping closer, not lowering his voice, and said that if there ever came a day when she wanted companionship rather than solitude, he would meet her where she stood, without title or claim, and if that day never came, he would respect the life she had chosen fully. The statement did not ask for an answer, and that was its strength. Elena considered him in the light, the space between them unchanged, and understood that trust had not returned as a spark but as a structure, assembled piece by piece, tested by weather and time, and she replied simply that she valued who she had become here, that any future would have to add to that, not replace it. Rowan accepted this with a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of terms stated plainly, and as he turned to leave, Elena felt no urgency to stop him, only a sense of completion, as if a circle had closed without sealing shut. She remained on the porch as he walked back toward the trail, the distance increasing without strain, and when he disappeared beyond the trees, she did not retreat inside immediately. She stood and watched the horizon until the light shifted, feeling neither alone nor claimed, but present. That evening she lit the lantern, checked the latch, and sat at the table to write, noting progress, plans, and a single line that captured what the season had taught her, that rebuilding was not about returning to what was lost, but about choosing what was worthy of staying. And as night settled gently around the cabin, Elena rested in the certainty that whatever came next would be built with intention, on foundations she trusted, and on terms she had earned.